She woke up in a penthouse she didn't recognize, in a city that wasn't her home. Her life ripped away by a man she couldn't even remember. Amara Thompson, a 32-year-old black nurse who spent her days saving lives in Baltimore's poorest neighborhoods, had been kidnapped by a Korean crime lord who claimed she belonged to him. Kang Dae-jung stood before her in a $5,000 suit, his dark eyes burning with obsession as he spoke words that made her blood run cold. "I've come back to fulfill my promise. You're going to marry me." 15 years ago, when she was just 10 years old, Amara had saved a bleeding Korean boy in an alley, bandaged his wounds with scraps of her own shirt, fed him the little rice she had. Before he disappeared back to Korea, that 12-year-old boy had made her a promise. "When I grow up, I'll come back and marry you." She'd thought it was sweet, childish fantasy. She'd forgotten completely. But he never forgot. For 15 years, this dangerous man tracked her every move, knew her schedule, her patience, even the coffee she bought. And now he'd stolen her from her life, paid her dying mother's medical bills, and trapped her in luxury that felt like a beautiful cage. "You saved me once," he whispered. "Now let me protect you, even if you hate me for it." But what Amara didn't know was that his enemies had discovered her existence. And what happened next, when rival gangsters tortured her to get to him, when he slaughtered 12 men to save her, when she finally remembered that terrified boy and the monster he'd become, it would force her to make an impossible choice between the life she knew and a love built on blood and broken promises. Subscribe now, because what happens when a nurse falls for the criminal who kidnapped her will leave you absolutely speechless. The rain fell mercilessly on the cold streets of Baltimore that October night, each drop seeming to wash away the last remnants of hope from a world grown cruel and indifferent. Amara Thompson, a 32-year-old black woman with eyes that still held kindness despite years of struggle, pushed through the heavy glass doors of the community clinic where she had just completed another soul-crushing 16-hour shift. Her feet ached with exhaustion that ran deeper than bone, deeper than muscle, settling into that hollow place in her chest where dreams used to live before medical bills and double shifts killed them one by one. She pulled her worn jacket tighter against the biting wind, her dark skin glistening with raindrops that felt like tears from a sky that understood her suffering. Amara didn't know it yet, but this night, this cursed, storm-drenched night, would shatter her simple existence into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Little did she know that across an ocean, a man had been counting down the years, the months, the very hours until this exact moment. The parking lot stretched before her like a dark ocean, nearly empty except for her old sedan sitting alone under a flickering streetlight. She fumbled for her keys with trembling fingers, too tired to notice the 3 shadows detaching themselves from the darkness, moving toward her with predatory intent. Too exhausted to hear their footsteps splashing through puddles until it was far, far too late. "Well, well." A rough voice cut through the rain. "Look what we have here." Amara's blood turned to ice. She spun around to find 3 men surrounding her, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods, their intentions crystal clear in their aggressive stance. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately seeking escape. This black woman who had dedicated her entire life to saving others now found herself utterly helpless, completely alone. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with terror. "I don't have any money. I'm just a nurse. I'm nobody." "Oh, you're somebody, all right," the largest man sneered, stepping closer. "You just don't know it yet." But before he could lay a single filthy hand on her, before Amara could even scream for help that would never come, The night exploded into chaos. A black limousine, sleek and expensive as sin itself, appeared from nowhere, tires screeching against wet pavement. Men in dark suits poured out like avenging angels, moving with military precision that spoke of training far beyond anything legal or merciful. The attack was brutal, efficient, terrifyingly professional. Amara watched in frozen horror as her would-be attackers were neutralized with bone-crunching violence, their bodies hitting the ground with sickening thuds. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. Who were these people? Why were they here? What did they want from a simple black nurse who only wanted to go home and collapse into bed? And then, he stepped out of the limousine. Kang Dae-jung emerged into the rain like a king surveying his kingdom, impeccable in an Italian suit that cost more than Amara made in 3 months. At 34 years old, he was devastatingly handsome in a dangerous, predatory way, with sharp features and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow light itself. But it was the intensity in those eyes, the burning obsession fixed solely on her, that made Amara's survival instincts scream in primal terror. He walked toward her slowly, deliberately, each step measured and purposeful. Rain cascaded down his perfect face, but he didn't seem to notice. His entire world had narrowed to this one black woman standing frozen in a parking lot, looking at him with absolutely no recognition whatsoever. "Amara Thompson," he said, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as a blade, carrying just the faintest trace of a Korean accent that made her name sound like a prayer on his lips. "After 15 long years, we finally meet again." I don't know you," Amara stammered, her mind racing through faces, memories, trying desperately to place this dangerous stranger who knew her name. "Please, there's been some mistake." "No mistake," Dae-jung interrupted softly, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive cologne mixing with rain and something darker underneath. He extended his right hand, palm up, revealing a pale scar that cut across his wrist. "You gave me this 15 years ago. Do you remember now?" Amara stared at the scar, and somewhere deep in the murky waters of childhood memory, something stirred. Something small and fragile, like a dream half forgotten upon waking. A boy, bleeding, crying, hands so small wrapping torn fabric around a wounded wrist. But before the memory could fully surface, Dae-jung spoke again, and his words detonated like bombs in her reality. "I've come back to fulfill my promise, Amara. The promise I made when I was 12 years old and you saved my life in that filthy alley." His dark eyes burned with an emotion so intense it terrified her. "I told you I would come back and marry you. I told you I would give you everything you deserved. And I am a man who always keeps his promises." "You're insane," Amara whispered, backing away, her survival instincts finally overriding her shock. "I don't know what you think happened, but I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm calling the police." She turned to run, but Dae-jung merely raised one hand in a small gesture. Instantly, 2 of his men blocked her path, their faces expressionless, their bodies radiating controlled violence. Amara's world tilted sickeningly. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "I understand you're frightened," Dae-jung said, his voice carrying an awful gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I understand this must seem sudden, overwhelming, but those men who just tried to attack you, they weren't random criminals, Amara. They were sent by my enemies. People who discovered your existence and wanted to use you against me." "Use me?" Amara's voice rose to a desperate pitch. "I don't even know you. How could anyone use me against you?" "Because I've been protecting you for 15 years, Dae-jung said simply, as if this explained everything, as if years of stalking were somehow romantic. "I've had people watching over you, keeping you safe, making sure no harm came to the girl who saved me. But my enemies are getting bolder, more desperate. You're in danger now, real danger, and I will not allow anything to happen to you." "You're kidnapping me," Amara said, the horrible truth settling over her like a funeral shroud. "You're actually kidnapping me." "I'm protecting what's mine," Dae-jung corrected, and the possessiveness in his voice made her skin crawl. He gestured toward the limousine. "You'll come with me now. Your mother's medical bills have already been paid in full. She's been transferred to the best private hospital in New York City, where she'll receive treatment that will actually save her life instead of just prolonging her suffering." Amara's heart stopped. My mother? How do you know about my mother's condition?" "I know everything about you, Amara," Dae-jung said softly. And in that moment, this black woman who had spent her entire life caring for others realized she had somehow become the obsession of a monster wearing a beautiful face. "Now please, get in the car. We have so much to discuss, you and I. 15 years of catching up to do." And as Amara Thompson stood in that rain-soaked parking lot, surrounded by dangerous men and facing a future she couldn't begin to comprehend, she understood with crushing certainty that her simple, humble life had just ended forever. Amara opened her eyes to unfamiliar luxury that felt like a beautiful cage designed specifically to trap her. The bedroom where she found herself was larger than her entire apartment back in Baltimore, decorated in shades of cream and gold that whispered of wealth beyond her comprehension. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, the city lights twinkling like false stars in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. Her head pounded with the remnants of whatever sedative they'd given her when she'd tried to fight, tried to escape from the limousine. The last thing she remembered was screaming, clawing at the door, and then Dae-jung's voice, so terribly gentle, saying, "Forgive me," before everything went dark. "You're awake." That same voice spoke now from the doorway, and Amara's entire body went rigid with fear and fury. Dae-jung stood there in casual clothes that probably cost more than her yearly salary, holding a tray with breakfast that smelled divine and looked like something from a 5-star restaurant. He appeared completely at ease, as if drugging and kidnapping a black woman was simply another Tuesday in his twisted world. "Don't come near me," Amara hissed, scrambling back against the headboard, her dark eyes blazing with righteous rage. "Don't you dare come near me, you monster." Pain flickered across Dae-jung's handsome features, genuine hurt that she might have found touching if he hadn't literally stolen her from her life. "I know you're angry." "Angry?" Amara's voice rose to a shout that echoed off the expensive walls. "You kidnapped me. You drugged me. You ripped me away from my job, my home, my mother." Tears of fury and helplessness streamed down her beautiful black face. What kind of sick person thinks this is love? What kind of psychopath thinks a childhood promise gives him ownership of another human being? "I never said I owned you," Dae-jung said quietly, setting the tray on a nearby table with careful precision. "I said I would protect you, and I have."
Your mother received her first dialysis treatment 2 hours ago at Presbyterian Hospital. The doctors say with proper care, she could live another 20 years instead of the 6 months she had left. The words hit Amara like physical blows. 6 months. The doctors had told her mother had years, but they've been lying, hadn't they? Sparing her feelings while her mother slowly died because they couldn't afford proper treatment. And this man, this dangerous stranger,
had somehow known the truth and fixed it with a snap of his wealthy fingers. "I don't want your money," she whispered, but the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Then consider it payment for a debt 15 years overdue," Daejing replied, moving closer despite her warning. He sat at the edge of the bed, maintaining careful distance, his dark eyes fixed on her with that unsettling intensity that made her feel simultaneously terrified and strangely seen. "When I was 12 years old, beaten nearly to death by my alcoholic father, left bleeding in a filthy alley in a country that wasn't even mine, you found me. Do you remember now, Amara? Do you remember the scared little Korean boy you hid in your apartment? The one you fed rice to even though you barely had enough for yourself?" Amara closed her eyes, and the memories came rushing back like a dam breaking. A boy with a split lip and bruised ribs, crying silently because he'd learned long ago that making noise only brought more pain. His small hands trembling as she'd wrapped his wounded wrist in strips of her old t-shirt. The way he'd looked at her like she was an angel descended from heaven, instead of just a 10-year-old black girl from the poorest part of Baltimore. "I remember," she whispered, opening her eyes to find Daejung watching her with naked vulnerability that didn't match the dangerous crime lord he'd become. "You were so small, so hurt. I couldn't leave you there." "No, you couldn't," Daejung agreed softly, "because even at 10 years old, you had a heart incapable of ignoring suffering. That's who you are, Amara Thompson. That's who you've always been." He held up his scarred wrist. "Before I left Baltimore, before my uncle took me back to Korea, I made you a promise. Do you remember what I said?" "You said you'd marry me when you grew up," Amara recalled. And despite everything, despite the insanity of this situation, her lips curved into the saddest smile. "You said you'd give me everything I deserved. I thought it was sweet. Just a child's fantasy." "It was never a fantasy to me," Daejung said with frightening sincerity. "It was a vow, the only pure promise I've ever made in my entire corrupted life. And I always keep my promises, Amara." "By becoming a criminal?" she shot back, anger returning to replace the dangerous softness that had been creeping into her heart. "By building an empire on blood and violence? That scared little boy I helped? He would be horrified by what you've become." The words struck home. Amara saw it in the way Daejun flinched, in the way his jaw tightened with self-loathing that ran bone deep. "You're right," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion he usually kept buried under layers of cold control. "That boy would be terrified of me. But that boy didn't survive the world I was thrown into. I did what I had to do to live, to gain power, to become strong enough that no one could ever hurt me again." His dark eyes met hers. "Strong enough to protect the one person who showed me kindness when I had nothing." "I don't need your protection," Amara insisted. But even as she said it, she remembered the men in the parking lot, remembered Daejun's warning about enemies who knew of her existence. "Yes, you do," Daejun countered grimly. "The moment my rivals discovered I'd been tracking you for 15 years, the moment they realized you mattered to me, you became a target. Park Min-seok, my chief competitor, already tried to have you taken. Those men last night were his. And he won't stop, Amara. He'll use you to get to me, and I will not let that happen." "So what?" Amara demanded. "I'm supposed to just accept this? Live in this golden cage while you play gangster? Pretend this is normal?" "You're free to go anywhere you want," Daejung said, standing and gesturing to the door. "I mean that sincerely. But my men will accompany you. They'll keep you safe. And every night you'll return here, where I can protect you properly." He walked to the window, silhouetted against the morning sun like a dark angel. I know what I am, Amara. I know my hands are stained with blood that will never wash clean. But those dirty hands are the only thing standing between you and people who would tear you apart just to hurt me. Amara stared at his back, at the rigid set of his shoulders, and realized with sinking dread that he genuinely believed every word. This wasn't just obsession. It was devotion twisted into something dangerous and possessive by years of violence and survival in a world she couldn't begin to understand. I want to see my mother, she said finally, because what else could she say? What choice did she really have? Of course. Dae-jung turned, and the relief on his face was almost heartbreaking. Whenever you wish. I've arranged for a private room, the best doctors, everything she needs. And if I try to run? Amara asked, testing the boundaries of this bizarre prison. Then I'll find you, Dae-jung said simply, without threat, just stating an inevitable fact. I've been finding you for 15 years, Amara. I know every place you go, every person you care about, every dream you've ever had. He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, could see the shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights haunted by demons she couldn't imagine. But I'm hoping eventually you'll stop wanting to run.
I'm hoping you'll remember the boy who made you a promise, and maybe you'll let him try to keep it. And as Amara Thompson sat in that luxurious bedroom, looking into the eyes of a monster who still carried the ghost of a broken child inside him, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. Part of her, some small, traitorous part, wanted to remember that boy. Wanted to believe that salvation was still possible, even for someone who'd fallen so far into darkness. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that at that very moment, Park Min-seok was planning something that would test both her compassion and Dae-jung's devotion in ways neither of them could survive unchanged. The days that followed were a surreal dance between captor and captive, between a black woman clinging to her identity and a Korean crime lord who believed he was fulfilling destiny. Amara tested the boundaries of her golden cage relentlessly, visiting her mother at the hospital with armed guards shadowing her every step, walking through Central Park with men in dark suits maintaining careful distance, even returning to her old clinic where patients stared at her expensive new clothes with confused recognition. But every night, as Dae-jung had promised, she returned to the penthouse. And every night she found him waiting, his dark eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that should have terrified her, but instead sparked something far more dangerous in her chest. Something she refused to acknowledge, refused to name. It was on the 8th night when everything shattered beyond repair. Amara was visiting her mother, watching the older black woman sleep peacefully for the first time in years, color returning to her face thanks to treatments they could never have afforded. The irony wasn't lost on Amara. Her freedom had been stolen, but her mother's life had been saved. What did that make her? Grateful? Complicit? Or simply human, trying to survive an impossible situation? Ms. Thompson? A nurse appeared in the doorway, young and nervous. There is a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent. Amara frowned. Dae-jung's men wouldn't announce themselves through a nurse. Who? But before she could finish, the nurse collapsed, revealing the man who'd struck her from behind. He was Korean, older than Dae-jung, with cruel eyes and a smile that promised violence. Behind him, 3 more men filed into the hospital room, moving with the same deadly efficiency as Dae-jung's guards. Amara Thompson, the man said in accented English, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. How fortunate to finally meet you. I am Park Min-seok,
And you, my dear, are coming with me. Terror exploded through Amara's body. My mother will be fine, Min Sok interrupted coldly. We have no interest in sick old black women. Only in the one Kang De-jung has been obsessing over like a lovesick fool. He gestured sharply. Take her, and make sure she screams loud enough for Kang to hear across the city when we send him the video. Amara fought. God, how she fought. But these men were trained killers, and she was just a nurse, just a black woman who'd spent her life healing instead of hurting. They bound her hands, gagged her screams, and dragged her from the hospital through service corridors while her mother slept on, blissfully unaware that her daughter was being stolen into nightmare. The warehouse where they took her smelled of rust and despair, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look sickly and wrong. Min Sok circled her like a predator, his phone already recording as Amara knelt on cold concrete, tears streaming down her beautiful, dark face. Look at the camera, pretty thing, Min Sok commanded, grabbing her jaw roughly. Say hello to Kang De-jung. Tell him how much you're enjoying my hospitality. When Amara remained silent, defiant even in terror, Min Suk's expression darkened. Perhaps you need motivation. He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward with a knife that gleamed under the cruel lights. The first cut was shallow, across her upper arm, designed to hurt without causing serious damage. Amara screamed behind the gag, her entire body convulsing with pain she'd never experienced. She'd stitched wounds, treated injuries, but feeling the blades slice her own flesh was agony beyond comprehension. That's better, Min Suk purred, filming her suffering. Now Kang will understand the price of his sentimentality. Now he'll learn what happens when powerful men weaken themselves over black American nurses who mean nothing in our world. But Amara meant everything. And what Min Suk didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Kang De-jung would burn the entire city to ash before allowing her to suffer. The assault came less than an hour later. The warehouse doors exploded inward with deafening force. De-jung entered like an avenging angel of death, surrounded by his most loyal men, his handsome face transformed into something absolutely terrifying. He'd seen the video. He'd heard Amara's screams. And something fundamental had broken inside him, some last restraint that had been keeping the monster partially chained.
Min Suk!
His voice echoed through the warehouse like thunder from an angry god.
You made a grave mistake touching what belongs to me.
The battle that erupted was hell made manifest. Gunfire, screams, the sickening sound of bodies hitting concrete. Amara watched through tear-blurred vision as De-jung fought with inhuman ferocity, killing anyone between him and her with brutal efficiency. This wasn't the controlled crime lord who'd been courting her with careful gentleness. This was the true monster, unleashed and unstoppable. When he reached Min Sok, De-jung didn't simply kill him. He made it slow, made it agonizing, spoke words in Korean that sounded like ancient curses, while his rival screamed for mercy that would never come. Amara wanted to look away, wanted to close her eyes against the violence, but she couldn't. She was frozen, watching the man who'd saved a 12-year-old boy become the very devil himself. Finally, mercifully, it ended. Min Suk's body lay broken and still, and De-jung turned to Amara, his expensive suit soaked with blood that wasn't his own. For a moment, she saw uncertainty in his eyes, fear that she would look at him with the horror he deserved. But then training overtook trauma. Amara was a nurse before she was a captive, a healer before she was a victim. "You're hurt," she heard herself say, her voice raw from screaming. "Your shoulder. You're bleeding." "It doesn't matter," Taejung said roughly, cutting through her bonds with hands that trembled despite the violence they'd just committed. "You're safe. That's all that matters." "I'm sorry. God, Amara, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. All of this is my fault." He lifted her in his arms like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his blood-soaked chest as if she were the most precious thing in existence. And despite everything, despite the horror and the violence and the absolute insanity of her situation, Amara found herself clinging to him, burying her face against his neck and breathing in the scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne, and something uniquely him. "I've got you," Taejung whispered against her hair, his voice breaking with emotion he'd never shown before. "I've got you, and I swear on everything I am, nothing will hurt you again. I'll kill thousands before I let anyone touch you. Do you understand? Thousands." And Amara did understand. She understood that this man, this beautiful monster, was completely, utterly, dangerously obsessed with her. She understood that his promise wasn't hyperbole, but literal truth. She understood that somewhere between childhood kindness and adult obsession, Kang Dae-jung had decided that Amara Thompson was the only pure thing in his corrupted world, and he would destroy anything that threatened that purity. At the hospital, while doctors treated her wounds, the memories came flooding back in overwhelming waves. Not just the boy she'd saved, but everything. The way he'd looked at her with such desperate gratitude. The way his small hand had gripped hers when he made that impossible promise. The way he'd cried when his uncle came to take him away, looking back at her like she was the only light in his darkness. "You remember," Dae-jung said from the doorway. And it wasn't a question. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she looked at him now with understanding instead of just fear. "I remember everything," Amara whispered, her dark eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. "I remember that sweet boy who just wanted someone to care about him. And I see what he became. I see what the world made him into." Dae-jung crossed the room and did something he'd never done before. He knelt. This powerful crime lord, this man who commanded empires and inspired terror, dropped to his knees before a black nurse and bowed his head. "I know I'm a monster," he said, his voice raw with self-hatred and longing. "I know my hands are too stained with blood to ever touch yours the way I want to. I know that boy you saved would be horrified by the man I've become. But that promise," his voice broke. "That promise is the only clean thing left inside me, Amara. It's the only part of my soul that hasn't rotted completely. If you tell me to leave, I will. If you say you can never forgive what I've dragged you into, I'll accept it. But please." He finally looked up, and his eyes were swimming with tears. "Please let me protect you until my enemies forget your name. Let me keep you safe, even if you hate me for it. Because I can't survive knowing you're in danger because of me." Amara stared down at this broken man, and somewhere deep inside, something fundamental shifted in her heart. Amara's hand trembled as she reached down and touched Dae-jung's face, her dark fingers gentle against his tear-stained cheek. This black woman who had spent her entire life saving broken things looked into the eyes of the most broken man she'd ever encountered and made a decision that would alter both their destinies forever. "I don't hate you," she whispered, and the words felt like both confession and condemnation. "God help me, I should. I should despise everything you are, everything you've done. But when I look at you, I still see that terrified boy bleeding in an alley, and I can't abandon him again." Daejung's expression transformed into something between hope and anguish. "You're staying? You're choosing to stay?" "I'm choosing to understand," Amara corrected softly. "There's a difference. I need to know the man you became, Daejung. Not the monster your enemies fear, but the person behind the violence. Because somewhere inside you, that boy still exists. I feel him every time you look at me." What Amara didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in that moment, was that her decision had just signed both their death warrants. Because across the ocean, in Seoul, the Supreme Council of Daejung's criminal syndicate had been watching, waiting, and growing increasingly furious at their once reliable enforcer's dangerous obsession with an insignificant Black American nurse. The summons came 3 days later. Cho Hwan-jin, the 70-year-old patriarch who controlled the entire Korean criminal network, demanded Daejung's immediate return to Seoul. The message was clear and brutal. End the distraction permanently, or be ended himself. "I'm going with you," Amara insisted when Daejung tried to leave her behind in New York. "Absolutely not," Daejung responded, his voice hard with protective fury. "Cho doesn't make idle threats. If I bring you to Korea, he'll see it as open defiance. He'll order both our deaths." "Then we'll face it together," Amara said, with a stubbornness that matched his own. "I'm not some helpless damsel waiting in a tower, Daejung. You dragged me into your world. You made me matter to your enemies. So now you deal with the consequences of having someone who refuses to hide while you fight alone." The standoff lasted for hours, but eventually, Daejung's resolve crumbled before her determination. Because deep down, he couldn't bear to be separated from her. Not now. Not when he'd finally found her again after 15 years of searching. Seoul greeted them with rain, as if the heavens themselves wept for the tragedy about to unfold. Daejung took Amara to a safe house in the mountains outside the city, a traditional Korean home hidden among ancient trees where he'd spent brief moments of his childhood before everything fell apart. "This is where I used to hide when my father got drunk," he told her, standing on the wooden porch overlooking misty valleys. "I'd run here and pretend I was someone else. Someone good. Someone worthy of the kindness a little black girl once showed me." Amara stood beside him, her hand finding his. "You're still worthy, Daejung. You just forgot how to see it." But redemption would have to wait, because Cho's assassins were already coming. They attacked at dawn. 12 elite killers trained since childhood to eliminate targets without mercy. Daejung had only 3 loyal men with him, soldiers who'd chosen to stand with him even knowing it meant certain death. The odds were impossible. Suicidal. But he'd faced worse. What he'd never faced before was fighting with something to lose. Someone to protect who mattered more than his own survival. The battle was chaos incarnate. Amara huddled in the hidden basement Daejung had shown her, listening to gunfire and screams and the terrible sounds of men dying violently above her head. She clutched a phone he'd given her, his final instruction crystal clear. If he fell, she was to call a number that would get her safely back to America. Back to her old life. Back to the person she'd been before a childhood promise dragged her into nightmare. But Amara Thompson had never been good at following instructions when people needed saving. When she heard Dae-jung cry out in pain, when she heard the assassin's cold voice announcing, "Kang Dae-jung, your weakness has killed you," something inside her snapped. This black woman who'd spent her entire life healing instead of hurting, who'd chosen compassion over violence every single day, made a choice that defied everything she'd ever believed about herself. She emerged from the basement. The lead assassin had Dae-jung pinned against the wall, blood streaming from wounds across his body, defeat written in his exhausted eyes. The killer raised his gun for the execution shot, and that's when he saw her. "The black woman," he said with cold satisfaction. "How convenient. Cho wanted proof of your death as well." "Wait," Amara commanded, her voice ringing with authority she'd never known she possessed. She walked forward slowly, deliberately, placing herself directly between the assassin and Dae-jung. "If you want to kill him, you'll have to kill me first. Because he's only here, only in this position, only vulnerable because of me. So if his weakness is my existence, then his death is my responsibility." "Amara, no!" Dae-jung gasped, trying to push her aside even as his strength failed. "Don't do this, please." But she stood firm, this beautiful black woman facing down a trained killer with nothing but conviction and desperate love she'd finally stopped denying. "He made me a promise when he was 12 years old," she told the assassin. "A stupid, impossible, childish promise that he's spent his entire life trying to keep. If you kill him, you kill the last person in your organization who understands that promises still mean something, that loyalty goes deeper than fear." The assassin hesitated, confused by her courage, uncertain in ways his training had never prepared him for. And in that fraction of a second, Dae-jung found his final reserves of strength. He moved like lightning despite his wounds, disarming the killer and ending the threat with brutal finality. The silence that followed was deafening. Dae-jung collapsed, and Amara caught him, cradling his blood-soaked body against hers. "You're insane," he whispered, touching her face with trembling fingers. "You could have escaped, could have lived." "Not without you," Amara admitted, tears streaming down her dark cheeks, because somewhere between the kidnapping and the violence and the absolute insanity of this situation, I fell in love with that broken boy who never stopped keeping his promises, and I can't abandon him. Not again. Not ever. The weeks that followed were a revolution written in sacrifice and blood. Dae-jung renounced his position, dismantled his empire, walked away from everything he'd built. The price was exile, was being marked for death, was knowing that peace would never truly be theirs. But for the first time since childhood, he was free. They disappeared to a small town in Oregon, far from the reaches of Korean crime syndicates, far from the world that had tried to destroy them both. Amara returned to nursing at a local clinic. Dae-jung learned to be ordinary, though nightmares still haunted him, though his hands still trembled remembering the blood. 2 years later, in a simple civil ceremony with no witnesses except Amara's mother and 2 friends from the clinic, Kang Dae-jung finally fulfilled the promise made by a terrified 12-year-old boy. He married Amara Thompson, not with empires or wealth or power, but with the only thing that truly mattered. A heart that had learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but choosing a different future every single day. "Do you regret it?" he asked her on their wedding night, holding her close in their modest apartment. "Choosing me? Choosing this life of always looking over our shoulders?" Amara looked into his eyes, those dark eyes that still held echoes of the frightened child she'd saved so long ago, and smiled with absolute certainty. "I regret nothing," she said firmly, because that scared little boy deserved someone who would fight for him. And the man he became, despite everything, despite all the darkness, he deserves love too. Even if it's complicated, even if it's dangerous, even if it means we'll never be completely safe. She kissed him then, this black woman who'd saved a life 15 years ago and discovered that some promises, no matter how impossible they seem, are worth every scar they leave behind. Because true redemption isn't found in forgetting the monsters we've been, but in finding someone brave enough to love us anyway, and choosing every day to become worthy of that love. And in the quiet of their simple home, far from empires and violence and the ghosts of who they used to be, two broken souls finally found the peace they'd both been searching for since childhood. Not perfect peace, not safe peace, but real, honest, hard-won peace built on a foundation of a promise kept and a love that refused to die, no matter how many times the world tried to kill it. Because some promises, the ones made by children who still believe in goodness, are the only things powerful enough to save us from ourselves.